You can defeat an army with cannons. You can bankrupt a class with economics. But how do you kill an idea? An idea as powerful as the noble chivalrous knight. You don't attack it with a sword. You attack it with a joke. This is the story of the final cultural death blow to the age of chivalry. It wasn't delivered on a battlefield, but from the pages of a book. In this video, we will discover how one of the greatest novels ever written, Don Quixote, turned Europe's most revered hero into its most lovable fool and laughed an entire era into its grave. Part 1. The Knight Becomes a Fiction. By the late 16th century, the military knight was a ghost. He had been rendered obsolete by guns, pikes, and professional armies. He was a relic. But while the real knight was gone, the idea of the knight was more popular than ever. Printing presses across Europe were churning out chivalric romance novels. These were fantastical stories filled with dragon-slaying damsels in distress and knights of impossible virtue. The public couldn't get enough of them. An entire industry was built on selling a fantasy of an age that had already passed. But this created a massive gap between the stories people read and the world they actually lived in. The real world was one of complex politics, emerging science, and a rising merchant class. In this new pragmatic world, the lofty black and white ideals of chivalry started to look less like a noble code and more like a foolish fantasy. Society was ready to laugh at its old heroes. Part 2. The First Jokes, the Rise of Satire. Before the great novel, the first attacks came from the stage and the court. Playwrights and court jesters began to see the knight not as a hero to be admired, but as a character to be mocked. In plays, the knight character started to shift. He was no longer always the valiant protagonist. Sometimes he was a boastful coward like Shakespeare's Falstaff, who talks endlessly of honor but runs from any real danger. Other times he was a hopelessly naive fool, a country gentleman who thinks his noble birth makes him a great warrior. This was the beginning of the end culturally. Society was learning to laugh at the knight. They were pointing out the absurdity of his elaborate rituals, his flowery language of love, and his outdated code of honor. The cultural pedestal upon which the knight stood for centuries was beginning to crack. All that was needed was one final masterful push to topple it completely. Part 3. The Madman of La Mancha. Enter Don Quixote. That push came in the early 1600s from a Spanish writer named Miguel de Cervantes. His masterpiece, Don Quixote, is considered the first modern novel, and it was a weapon of mass cultural destruction. The premise is simple and brilliant. An aging minor nobleman named Alonso Quijano reads so many of these chivalric romance novels that he loses his sanity. He believes the stories are real. So he renames himself Don Quixote de la Mancha, puts on a rusty suit of his great-grandfather's armor, and rides out on his old tired horse to become a knight-errant and right the wrongs of the world. He recruits a simple, pragmatic peasant, Sancho Panza, to be his squire, promising him an island to govern. And together they embark on a series of adventures. But Don Quixote sees the world not as it is, but as it should be according to his books. He fights windmills convinced they are ferocious giants. He rescues a common peasant girl believing she is the beautiful princess Dulcinea. He follows the code of chivalry to the absolute letter in a world that finds his actions utterly insane. Part 4. The killing joke, why Quixote was so devastating. The genius of Don Quixote is that it was not a hateful attack. Cervantes himself seemed to love the stories he was mocking. Don Quixote is not a villain. He is a good, kind, and fundamentally decent man. His intentions are always noble. He truly wants to protect the weak and uphold justice, and that is precisely why the satire is so devastating. By creating a lovable hero who sincerely believes in the code of chivalry, Cervantes shows how utterly absurd, impractical, and even harmful that code is when applied to the real world. When Don Quixote liberates a group of prisoners, they thank him by beating him and stealing his belongings. When he defends a young boy from a beating, the boy's master beats him even more severely the moment the knight leaves. The book forces the reader to laugh, not at a caricature, but at the ideals themselves. It's a deep, thoughtful laughter that leads to a profound realization: the world is too complex, too messy, and too cynical for a simple code of black and white honor. Don Quixote was a colossal success. It was read all over Europe, and after it was published, it became almost impossible for anyone to write a serious chivalric romance again without it seeming like a parody. Cervantes had so perfectly captured the absurdity of the genre that he had effectively killed it. He had turned Europe's greatest hero into its most beloved fool. So the knight's death came in 3 stages. First, he was made obsolete on the battlefield by pikes and gunpowder. Second, he was made irrelevant in politics by kings and their new armies. And finally, his very idea, his cultural ghost, was laid to rest by a novelist who made the world laugh at him. The pen truly was mightier than the sword. An idea can survive cannon's economic collapse and political irrelevance, but it cannot survive being turned into a joke. The moment Europe began to laugh with and at the lovable, tragic figure of Don Quixote, the age of chivalry was truly over. This story of how culture and ideas can shape our perception of history is a critical part of our journey. If you were fascinated by the power of a single book, to end an era, show your support by hitting the like button. And to continue exploring the complex legacies of the past, subscribe to The Knight's Journey and ring the notification bell. Because history is not only written by the victors of its battles, it is also written by the authors of its stories.